think, you know, overall it's good, and there's a sneak preview of the base that we're going to make. Hello and welcome to Painting Kings of War, Shadows in the North, the 2-player starter set. In this episode, part 8, we'll paint the Master Hunter. The model's been primed with Vallejo airbrush German red-brown, and then white ink has been applied from above to give a zenithal base layer, which will be the basis for everything we paint over the top, starting with Guilliman Flesh for all the skin areas. You notice she's got like a finger covering on her bow hand there. I'm going to use quite a few leather colours, and starting with Snakebite Leather contrast paint mixed with some red ink, in this case scale 75 intensity red. Now the red ink is very strong and it also thins out the contrast paint quite a bit. We're going to apply that to the boots and leather areas, including the inside of the cloak. You can see with the boots, I'm finding it hard to work out exactly which parts are leather boot and which parts are like a metal greave type of thing. Straight snakebite leather here on the trousers. Just letting the contrast paint do the work the contrast paint does and provide some nice shadows and sort of like, you know, almost like black lining between two sort of sharp points. So in this case, the trousers and the armor at the top of the boots. In terms of choosing where I put the colors, I'm just kind of like spacing them out. So trousers, sleeves, they can be snakebite leather. We'll leave some spaces to put other colors on the model in a way that once painted, it'll look visually appealing. Thinning the snakebite leather down a little bit, we're going to put like an underlayer now on this. It's what's going to end up being like a wolfskin coat, wolfskin cloak, I should say. So just making some patterns. You know, you kind of put that anywhere you want. A few lines and dots. It's going to get almost completely covered over by the end of the paint job. Mixing in a bit more red now to that mix that we had previously. I want the tabard dress thing that she's wearing to stand out quite a bit, but fit in with the theme of this army, which is kind of like warm leathers, and when I do the basing it's going to be like a snow basing. So nice contrast between the models and the basing. So I'm going to take a bit more time on this model than the clansmen and the pack hunters that we painted previously, so I'm using a smaller brush and trying to be a bit more precise. In the same way that we put some snakebite leather down on the cloak, we're going to do some Guilliman Flesh. Kind of, you know, somewhat random really. Just picking out some different leathery colours on different parts of the model. Like at the moment it looks a bit mishmash, but you know, I feel like it comes together when we get a bit further down the line. I felt like the trousers weren't dark enough, so we're putting another coat of snakebite leather on top. I feel like the contrast paints are really great for sort of starting out a model. You can, you know, either in terms of getting a really quick tabletop quality or as a starting point for a higher quality paint job. Putting another layer on the tabard here. If you saw my video for the horror, you realise that I got to a point where I wanted the model to look, you know, better than the rest of the troops in the army, because it's kind of like a character model. So same thing with this Master Hunter here. It wasn't going to be a case of just painting the contrast paints on top and kind of leaving it at that. So you saw I put a bit of the red colour on the cloak. Now going over the whole of the cloak with Guilliman Flesh, which is less pigmented than, say, the Snakebite Leather. It just ties it all in together really. So as with the clansman we painted, these like frilly bits on the model are going to be based mainly with skeleton horde. And now we're using wildwood to kind of fill in the gaps almost. The quiver, the arrows, and we'll also paint the bow and arrow. And we will use the wildwood also to base coat all the metal areas. I think, you know, wildwood's a great base coat, especially for warmer metals. You know, you can see I'm using a big brush here, size 6, so, you know, although we're being careful, you can still use a large brush to get this done, you know, reasonably quickly. Yeah, just being careful with the control of the paint flowing off the brush. You can, like I said, you can still be, you know, pretty careful even with a big brush. This one's got a reasonably sharp point on it, which helps. Just got to be aware that with the contrast paint, with that sort of style, the paint sort of flows off the end of the brush rather than you painting it onto the model. Hope that sort of makes sense. So if you're looking for a really warm look to a model, you know, I think this is, you know, a pretty good result so far. The cloak on the back I think is looking good with the mixture of the different patterns that we put on. We will end up painting that more of like a snowy white colour, and but we'll get to that shortly. So we're thinning down some black Templar here, about 50-50, and we're going to base coat the hair. I say base coat, the contrast paint, you know, it's kind of meant to be like a one coat does all. And you'll see the end result here when I paint the hair, that if you wanted to leave it like that, it kind of does the highlighting for you in a kind of basic level. I'll end up going over the hair a bit later because, like I said, we're going to end up sort of pushing this model a little bit further than the standard troops in the army. But, you know, if you're going for like a more of a grey, like a turning grey hair colour, that's a pretty good starting point there. Using a wet brush just to take off some of the contrast paint that went a bit mad and sort of ended up a little bit too much on the face. That's one of the great things with the contrast paint. Just, you know, have a wet brush to hand and you can pull off bits that go in the wrong places. Using the wildwood as well, just to add some shadows where the different parts of the cloak meet, and a few more sort of general spots on the cloak to add some variety. Just a little comparison there between one of the pack hunters we've already done and also a comparison with the horror, just to see if we're getting a similar overall quality, which at this point we're not. We're not quite there yet. So, dry brushing on some Karak stone, and then I realised sort of fairly quickly that we're going to go almost straight to the Aggaros flesh. We wanted a lighter dry brush. So the bristles are a tiny bit damp, and then we're really just going for a dry brush all over the cloak. Need to use a smaller brush sort of around the shoulders, or we're going to end up with a lot of that all over the hair and other parts of the model. And now all we're doing now is just adding in a little bit more white each time. Making sure the brush is very, very slightly damp somewhat reduces the chalky finish you can get with dry brushing, but it still needs you know, some extra stuff put on top of it to get rid of the chalkiness, and we'll come to that a bit later. But for now we're going to sort of move on to the metals and kind of do the first sort of base coat here onto all the metal parts. I like to do this, sort of move like all parts of the model along a little bit at a time, just so I can see where we are with it rather than like completely finishing one area. And it's brass scorpion we're using here, but you could really use any kind of brassy or bronze paint to get a really similar look. Painting over the wildwood is great because you can just leave the wildwood in the recesses and it does the shading for you. So you can see my Rune Lord brass is a little bit thick there. It's been sitting around for a while, so we'll stick on the wet palette, add a tiny bit of water to thin it down, and we're just going to use that to start highlighting the metal areas. quite a broad highlight at this point. You know, most of the flat surfaces are going to be highlighted at least sort of 50%, and then on the edges we'll put, you know, quite a bit of this slightly lighter colour paint. You could paint these areas in more of a steel colour if you wanted to add a lot of contrast between the leathers and the metal, but I wanted the whole model to be quite warm because the base is going to be quite cold. Going back in with the wildwood in some areas that got a bit covered up by the dry brush, you know, the white dry brush on the cloak. Now we're going to use some Karak stone to start kind of like an initial highlight on some of these. I don't even know what they are really. They're kind of like, I imagine that they're areas of fur, kind of like, you know, fur trimmings. Also start painting the sort of necklace thing that she's wearing. I will change that later because it's too much, it's too close to the colour of the cloak. So we're going to make an oil wash now. You know, use an old brush. Ideally use odourless thinners so it doesn't stink, and we're going to use a mixture of black and raw umber, and we want it to be reasonably thin, so we're going to mix that in. You'll see me add a little bit more of this odourless thinner. You see how thin it is there. It just sort of flows off the brush pretty well in. There we go. Yeah, sort of. You can see I've spilt some odourless thinner on the desk there, but that's what the mat's for. So I start by going over all the cloak, and you know it works really well as a wash on the cloak. You can see that. I decide that I'm going to actually use it on the whole model pretty much, bar the skin. It's hard to give an exact ratio of thinner to oil, but you can kind of see how well it's flowing to get an idea of how much I'm using. And then I just left that little bit in there just to show how easy it is to clean the brush off with some clean thinners and a cloth. Obviously don't lick it. Just using the cotton bud now. So it's been drying for, you know, about 10 minutes. Using a cotton bud, dipping it in the thinners, and going and wiping just wiping that wash off all the parts of the model that I don't really want it to be on. It will dull it down a little bit even though you're wiping it off. So now that it's dried a little bit, I'm using more of a rolling technique with a damp cotton bud, and that rolling technique means you're not going to be scrubbing the paint too much. Now that has really dulled down the metal, so we're going to go back in with the Rune Lord brass and reapply the highlights. You can see the whole model's got way more definition now, but even though we removed a fair bit of the wash, it has dulled down the colour of the model, completely all over really. You can see there where the wash was quite heavy. We're going to go back in and sort of re-establish those metal colours there, even in the areas which are kind of in shadow. Use the Aggaros Flesh to pick out individual strands on the cloak. I don't want to go back in with another dry brush because you can sort of see how the first dry brush went. It was a bit soft, and that's because although there's a lot of texture in the cloak, it's not like not like Games Workshop models where they're really sort of spiky ridges that work amazing for dry brushing. This one's a little bit softer, and so I want to go in with a brush and sort of pick out the areas that I want to be highlighted more. I found this quite fun as well, I'll be honest. Just adding some dead white into the Aggaros Flesh as we go in and add more highlights. You can see there it's thinned down a little bit, but part of that is the dead white being a bit thinner than the Aggaros Flesh, and part of it is just a wet palette thinning the paint a little bit. When you look at the cloak carefully, you can see some of those undertones that we put in. I can see some red areas, some more yellow areas, and then just some sort of like darker greys in there as well. So it wasn't a waste of time to put that underlayer in to start with, even though we're moving further and further away from that with the highlights. Using the same mix to highlight the trim a little bit as well. Getting pretty close to just white now on the tips of some of these areas. spent quite a bit of time on the cloaks. I feel like it's like a real main feature of the model. It's nice to have something on the back of the model that's a real eye catcher. Using some Ratskin flesh here to add some texture to these like inner areas of the cloak, which I'm imagining are like a leather, you know, I'm imagining that they're basically leather. So just some hatchwork, thin brush, paint's not too thin, just carefully going back and forward. I'm adding some of that scale 75 red ink to the Ratskin flesh, and that's to produce a highlight colour for the red parts of the clothing. I'm going to use some Elfic flesh now, one of my favourite colours. It's a little bit thicker and slightly different to like a pure ivory, but a great colour for highlighting these sort of like light yellow areas. You can see that I use the Elfic flesh to produce some highlights all down the arm there, and we went back in with the Snakebite Leather to re-establish the colour. So that's a really good use of contrast paints as kind of like a glaze back over the top of the highlights. Another good example of that here. So we'll add some texture into this part of the cloak with the Elfic flesh, and then just glaze straight back over it with the contrast paint. Going to move on to the bow now and start highlighting it with Vallejo earth, just towards the edges, and we'll keep the wildwood more in the recesses and on the underneath parts of the bow. The bow's really nicely sculpted, so it's really like, you know, a pleasure to highlight. We don't want to go too close to white because I do want the bow to be kind of like a wooden colour. It's not meant to be an ivory, so we'll just use we'll just like dot those highlights there on the corners. So yeah, the Elfic flesh and the Snakebite Leather, mix them in together. Another great use of contrast paints. Add a more opaque colour into the original contrast paint to provide the highlights over the top of areas that you've already painted with contrast paint previously. I think that's starting to, you know, look pretty good now. Those highlights feel like they're in the right area. I'm just going to use a bit of Aggaros Dunes to separate the cloak from the face. It's all a little bit sort of pale. Vallejo German Grey I'm using here. I really like that colour, and I'm wanting to change that the bone colour that we had on that necklace. I want it to look like the bluey stone that we're going to put on the arrow tip. It'll really help frame the face as well, because we'll have a dark colour above for the hair, and then the necklace and the arrow will, you know, make three areas of sort of like darker colour right down the centre of the model, with the face standing out in the middle towards the top of that. So we're going to start highlighting the face with a you know, a better brush now. So we're going to be more careful here, spending way more time than we would on some of the other models. So I decided at this point I want the hair to be darker, and I feel like that will help me when I'm painting the face. I'm also going to decide in a second to just repaint the face completely. The Guilliman Flesh contrast paint was too patchy over the Zenithal sort of like base coat, so we're going to go in here and sort of paint the whole of the face in a more traditional manner. And we're doing that with a nice easy mix, about 50-50 of Guilliman Flesh and the Elfic Flesh. And now we're going to go straight back to the Guilliman Flesh to reintroduce those shadows. So basically repainting the whole face. Same really with the hands. Here's the colours we're going to use for painting the you know, the stone areas. Very similar to what we did on the previous Northern Alliance models, but just taking it a little bit further, being a bit more careful. The German Grey I love as a base layer for any kind of grey. So you just see that we're going to kind of move through the blues towards the turquoise as we paint up the arrowhead here. It's a nice sculpt, especially with these couple of little bits of the arrowhead that stick above the binding area. They lend themselves to just sort of like dotting the corners. With the necklace, I'm kind of really just highlighting it towards the ends, and there's a little bit in the middle that has a bit more highlight to it as well. Kind of carefully, this is where we need a you know, decent brush, because we're going to carefully highlight down the center of the arrow as well. There's not really an easy way to do that. You can't really use the side of the brush. It's not particularly pronounced in the sculpt, so just gotta paint it carefully, really. As we move closer towards the white, we're just painting in smaller and smaller areas to make that highlight, to the point where at the end with a pure white, it's just a tiniest little dot on the ends. So I'm just mixing up some gradients here of the Guilliman Flesh and the Elfic Flesh, and we're going to just go in and carefully highlight the face. So cheekbones, chin, jawline, forehead, upper lip, they're all going to get highlighted, and it's just important to kind of do it gradually and carefully. We don't want it to look like sort of clown makeup at the end. I think I push it about as far as I'm willing to go in terms of having that kind of like traditional female face. What I was doing there was painting in the like the corners of the eyes where the Guilliman Flesh wash was, the Guilliman Flesh contrast paint wash was just a little bit too pronounced, and we wanted to lighten it up a bit. Mixing in a bit of the Elfic Flesh with the German Grey, and the German Grey is what we're going to use on the hair. It's just to produce some eyebrows that aren't too dark, because like again, we don't want it to be too cartoonish. So adding in a bit of the skin colour to the eyebrow colour really helps kind of like make it fairly subtle. The face is actually a really nice sculpt on this model, so yeah, fair play to Mantic. I think they did a great job on this model. And like I said, just going around and being careful, applying the highlights, really fun to paint. As you know, when you move the brush, the paint will, so we're using a lighter paint here, so as you move the brush, when you take the brush off the model, that's where most of the paint is going to be deposited. So don't leave the brush in a shadow area when you've got light paint on the brush, and the same for vice versa. When you're putting in some shadows, make sure when you do the paint stroke, leave the brush in the shadow area when you're applying shadows, which is what I'm doing now. So going in with some slightly thinned down Guilliman Flesh, sort of like there under the lip, on the cheeks. When you're doing these glazes, it's important to let each layer dry, so just blow the model or leave it for 10 seconds. You don't want to put a layer down, then a layer, then another glaze, and another glaze. You'll start pulling up the paint that you put down previously. So at this point, I think the face is looking really good. I'm happy with that. The camera's like very, very slightly softly focused, so I apologise for that, but hopefully you can sort of see what we're doing. So originally we painted the hair with just Black Templar, then I decided to redo it, so I painted it with German Grey, put Black Templar over it as a shade. Now we're going back in with German Grey to start some highlights on the hair. You can see me flicking back and forward here between different parts of the model. It's just how I do it. I like to progress various parts of the model rather than leaving one area completely unpainted. I find it hard to see what's happening with the overall paint job. So you can see I'm using the Elfic Flesh to add highlights to lots of the lighter areas of the model. I think it's great for highlighting. So yeah, not great focus on the camera here, I apologise about that, but just I've left it in just to show paint in the eyes, even though it's probably the part where you really need a sharp focus. So at the moment she looks like some sort of weird mage. The white I put in for the eyes was a little bit too big, so just sort of covered over it with Guilliman Flesh, which will sink into the eye sockets that are sculpted on. So using the German grey, a reasonable amount on the brush so it doesn't dry out, and we just want to put some pupils in. So to make it look like she's not staring wide-eyed, you need the pupils to go right to the bottom and right to the top of where we painted the white previously. Otherwise the pupils look small and very starey-eyed. And we're going to go back in with the dead white now, and we're just going to try and dot to the left and the right of the pupil. That's about as good as I can get on my camera. I think it looks, pretty good. Adding in some white to the German grey to put some highlights on the hair here. Yeah, just going back to the face, I think it's, she's got sort of like pinkish cheeks. I'm not doing that from a point of view of wanting her to look like like a model or anything like that. It's like she's going to be on a snow base, so she's going to be cold, her cheeks are going to be red. Just with regards to the hair here, yeah, we just want to paint the hair, not highlighted down all the strands, but as it would look naturally, where you kind of get like a horizontal band across the hair. Adding in some Vallejo metal colour silver to the Rune Lord brass as a kind of like a final silvery brass highlight on the metal areas. So you've probably seen in other videos, loads of people love this Vallejo metal colour, as do I. I think it's brilliant. So if you're ever in the if you're in the market for getting like one decent silver, get a Vallejo metal colour silver. It's the ones that come in the 32ml pots, not the dropper bottles, the normal dropper bottles. So just comparing with the horror there, just to see if we're getting a similar kind of result in terms of quality. And we're going to use a contrast paint now to, with a thin brush, and we're going to go in and just sort of pick out some of the areas between the strands on the cloak that we've already highlighted. While it's on the brush, just add a few shadows here and there. And then finally, just going to use a bit of the lightened Vallejo German grey to add a bit of texture to the hair. It's pretty flat on top. And here's what we got. I'm pleased with that. It's not a competition piece, that's for sure. It's not going to win any awards, but as a decent tabletop standard, I think it looks good. And compared to one of the Hunter Clansmen here, I think it fits in with the theme, but stands out enough to be a character model. And just taking a couple of decent photos here, it's not sort of it's not edited, particularly in Photoshop. Just the lighting is improved. I think overall it's good, and there's a sneak preview of the base that we're going to make. So stay tuned for some future videos if you want to see the snow basing, and you can see she's got a fair bit of snow all over her as well. If you've liked the video and found it useful, give us a like, leave us a comment. I really like getting comments. If there's anything else you want to see, let me know. If there's anything you think could have been done better in terms of making these videos, again, let me know. Thanks a lot.